Ethan, a 10-year-old black boy, orphaned and living on his own, helped Mrs. Rosen fix her old refrigerator. He thought it was just a small act of kindness. But the next day, when Mrs. Rosen showed up at their door with a police officer, Ethan had no idea that his life would change forever. Ethan cycled through the quiet streets in the weak afternoon sunlight. Although he was only 10 years old, he understood all too well the loneliness and hardships of life. Ethan's parents passed away when he was very young, and since then he had to fend for himself. Ethan had no siblings or relatives to rely on. He only had himself and his old bicycle. Every day he took on all kinds of jobs in the neighborhood to make a living, from gardening, cleaning, to repairing broken items that neighbors brought. In the early mornings he often walked around the neighborhood, looking for jobs to earn a few coins to buy food. Life was not easy, but Ethan always kept himself optimistic and kind. He was not afraid to take on any job, even the hardest. Long days of work did not diminish his kindness. Ethan was always ready to help people even though he did not have much. The difficult days taught Ethan many lessons. Having to fix his own things when he didn't have enough money to ask anyone else, Ethan became proficient in handling tools and equipment, from fixing electrical outlets, kitchen appliances to small appliances like flashlights or fans. The young boy accumulated an incredible amount of experience. His neighbors gradually learned about his repair skills and asked him for help whenever they needed it. Despite living alone and having to shoulder a lot of responsibility for his age, Ethan never allowed himself to become bitter. He always told himself that helping someone was a way to feel that he still had a meaning in this world. That was how Ethan felt alive and connected to the people around him, even though he didn't have a real family to rely on. One afternoon, like many others, Ethan rode his bike on the familiar path leading through the small neighborhood. The autumn air was gentle, the yellow leaves rustling under his wheels. Maple Street seemed quieter than usual today. Ethan let his mind drift in the quiet space. But suddenly an image made him stop. In front of the small pale yellow house, Mrs. Rosen, an old woman, was struggling with an old refrigerator right on the front lawn. Mrs. Rosen was old. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her hunched figure exuded fatigue. Ethan had known Mrs. Rosen for a long time, but he had never seen her in such trouble. The refrigerator in front of her seemed to be badly broken, and her confused expression only made things worse. She tried to flip the buttons back and forth, but all her efforts were in vain. Ethan stood there watching silently for a while. Mrs. Rosen, although she rarely talked to him, had always been a friendly neighbor. She often greeted him when he cycled past, and once she even gave him a hot homemade cookie on a cold afternoon. Those images warmed Ethan's heart, but today her face was not as bright as it had been before. She looked sad and helpless, making Ethan's heart feel the need to do something. He stopped the bike and walked towards Mrs. Rosen. "Do you need any help?" Ethan asked softly, trying not to startle her. Mrs. Rosen raised her head, her wrinkled eyes showing a hint of surprise. "Ethan, is that you?" she said, her voice hoarse and a little confused. "This refrigerator is broken and I don't know what to do," she sighed, pointing to the refrigerator with a trembling hand. "It's been here for a long time, a gift from my husband. I was going to make a meal today to celebrate our wedding, but it broke." Ethan looked at the refrigerator and felt the sadness in her voice. Mrs. Rosen used to be a good cook, but since her husband passed away, her passion for cooking has gradually faded. This old refrigerator is not just an appliance, but also contains memories of her late husband. Seeing her fumbling with the refrigerator, Ethan can't help but feel sympathy. "Let me try," Ethan said, stepping closer to the refrigerator. He was used to fixing small broken objects, and the refrigerator was no exception. "Do you know how to fix it?" Mrs. Rosen asked, both hopeful and worried. "I know a little about fixing things." "I'll try," Ethan replied, his hands quickly examining the parts. Ethan's actions were not simply fixing a refrigerator, but he realized that he was helping a lonely old woman. Ethan thought to himself, maybe Mrs. Rosen needed more than a working refrigerator. She needed someone to care for, to share with, and today he was the one to do that. Ethan knelt down next to the refrigerator, his eyes carefully examining the old parts. Although he had repaired many things before, this refrigerator was a bigger challenge. Mrs. Rosen stood beside him, looking at him worriedly, but said nothing. She knew the refrigerator was very old, and probably not an easy fix. "I need some parts to fix it," Ethan said, after a thorough inspection. Mrs. Rosen sighed softly, but Ethan reassured her with a small smile. "I'll do my best." Ethan rode his bike to the local used parts store. After a while of searching, he found what he needed and quickly returned. He set to work with perseverance and determination. Although he encountered many difficulties, his small hands did not falter. As Ethan assembled the last parts, he took a deep breath and turned the switch. The refrigerator hummed softly, then started working again. Mrs. Rosen could not believe her eyes. "Oh my gosh, you did it, Ethan," she exclaimed. Ethan smiled. "I'm so glad I could help." He knew he wasn't just fixing a refrigerator, he was helping Mrs. Rosen find her lost joy. The next morning, Ethan was sitting on the porch, watching the clouds drift across the sky. The chirping of birds and the gentle breeze made him feel at peace. He thought about yesterday and was glad that he had helped Mrs. Rosen fix the refrigerator. But his joy was quickly interrupted by a loud knock on the door. Ethan jumped up and went to open the door. Mrs. Rosen stood in front of the house, her face solemn, and beside her was a police officer in a majestic uniform. Ethan felt his heart beat faster. He didn't understand what was going on, and a feeling of anxiety rose in his heart. "Hello, Ethan," Mrs. Rosen said, her voice trembling but not hiding her emotion. "I'm sorry to scare you, but there's something important I want to talk to you and you're not a family about." The police officer stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Don't worry, nothing bad happened," he said softly, reassuring Ethan. "Mrs. Rosen asked me to come and testify for something special." Ethan was bewildered, his eyes darting between Mrs. Rosen and the policeman, trying to make sense of what was going on. Mrs. Rosen continued, her voice filled with emotion. "Ethan, you didn't just fix my refrigerator, you brought me joy and connection to life. After my husband died, I felt so alone. But you changed that." Ethan listened silently, his heart pounding at her words. "I wanted to do something to thank you," Miss Rosen continued, tears glistening in her eyes. "So I decided to set up a scholarship fund in my husband's name for you, so you can pursue your dreams and not have to worry about money." Ethan was stunned, not believing what he had just heard. He was just a 10-year-old orphan, struggling to make ends meet, and now he had received a gift greater than he could have imagined. The policeman nodded, confirming Mrs. Rosen's words. "All the legal formalities have been completed." Mrs. Rosen was very determined about this. "And you deserve it all." Ethan felt his eyes sting, but he tried to keep his composure. He bowed his head, not knowing what to say. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. Mrs. Rosen stepped forward, gently taking Ethan's hand. "No need to thank me, Ethan. You've helped me more than anyone could ever imagine. This is the least I can do for you." Since the special incident with the police, the relationship between Ethan and Mrs. Rosen has become closer than ever. She is no longer the lonely old neighbor that Ethan just happened to help. She has become a friend, someone that the orphan boy can rely on in his difficult life. Every day after work or school, Ethan often stops by Mrs. Rosen's house, sometimes just to sit and chat or help her with chores around the house. At those times, Mrs. Rosen tells him about her past, about the days when she and her late husband built a family together. Each of her stories is not only a memory but also a valuable lesson about love, loyalty, and patience. "You know, Ethan," Mrs. Rosen said one day as they sat together in her small garden, "when I was young, I dreamed of having a big family. But my husband and I didn't have any children. We had to accept that. I thought I would live the rest of my life alone. But then you came along, and you changed everything." Ethan said nothing, just smiled gently. He felt the warmth of this relationship, a special relationship that he had never had since his parents died. One afternoon, Mrs. Rosen decided to give Ethan a very special gift. She went into the bedroom and came back with a small wooden box. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, and inside was an antique clock, her husband's clock, the most important keepsake she had left. "Ethan, this is the most precious gift my husband ever had. He wore it all his life, and now I want to give it to you. You've become a part of my family, and I don't think anyone deserves it more." Ethan looked at the watch with wide, emotional eyes. He knew the value of this gift was not in the material but in the love Mrs. Rosen had put into it. He gently took the watch, feeling the warmth of her hand. "I don't know what to say, Grandma," Ethan whispered, his voice choked. "I will cherish it for the rest of my life." Mrs. Rosen smiled, placing her hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I know you will." From that day on, Ethan always carried the watch with him as a symbol of Mrs. Rosen's love and gratitude for him. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of the peaceful afternoons he spent with her, the stories she told, and the deep connection they had built. As time passed, winter came with its bitter cold. Ethan still visited Miss Rosen often, but he noticed that her health was gradually deteriorating. Her steps were slower, and sometimes she didn't have enough strength to tell Ethan stories like before. She no longer went out to tend her favorite garden, but often just sat in the living room, looking out the window with a distant look. One day, when Ethan went to her house as usual, he found her door still closed, unlike her usual open door waiting for him. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. Anxiety rose in his heart. Ethan hurriedly called the neighbors. When the door was opened, he saw Mrs. Rosen lying on the sofa, tired and lifeless like usual. She had fallen seriously ill. Ethan felt as if a cold wind swept through his heart. He had already lost his parents, and now the fear of losing another loved one was more evident than ever. Mrs. Rosen was rushed to the hospital, but the doctors said her condition was not good. The disease had been silently eating away at her all this time, and now it was taking away her last strength. During Mrs. Rosen's days in the hospital, Ethan visited her constantly. He sat by her bedside, held her hand tightly, and told her about the little things in her daily life. Even though she was getting weaker by the day, she still smiled whenever Ethan appeared. Their last moments together became more precious than ever. One cold morning, when Ethan arrived at the hospital, he received the news that Mrs. Rosen had passed away peacefully in her sleep. His heart was broken. Even though he knew this moment would come, he still couldn't stop the pain from rising. Mrs. Rosen, the person he considered his grandmother, was no more. The feeling of loss once again struck the 10-year-old boy who had experienced so much pain. But in that pain, Ethan also realized that Mrs. Rosen had left him with more than just good memories. She had given him love, support, and a priceless gift, belief in himself. Before she left Ethan a profound message that no matter how difficult life was, as long as he kept his faith and kindness, he would always find a way to move forward. Ethan stood in front of Mrs. Rosen's grave, her husband's watch still resting on his wrist. The winter sunlight shone on the white, sparkling snowflakes, reminding him of all the good things Mrs. Rosen had brought to his life. He promised himself that he would never give up on his dream of becoming an engineer, the dream that she believed he could achieve. From that moment on, Ethan was no longer the boy who only knew how to struggle to make a living. He became stronger and more determined than ever. He knew that he was not living just for himself, but also to continue the legacy of love and kindness that Mrs. Rosen had left behind. As time passed, Ethan still remembered Mrs. Rosen and the valuable lessons she left him. He went through many hardships, but Mrs. Rosen's love and trust helped Ethan continue his life with a clear goal: to become an engineer, someone who could repair and improve the world in his own way. Thanks to the scholarship fund that Mrs. Rosen established before she passed away, Ethan no longer had to worry about paying for his education. He focused on his studies, spending a lot of time researching and practicing the skills he was passionate about. In every engineering lecture, every time he solved complex math problems, Ethan always remembered Mrs. Rosen and the times he sat next to her, listening to her stories about her past, about her husband who used to be her whole world. The years of studying passed quickly. Ethan not only became a good student, but also a dedicated person to those around him. He regularly participates in community projects, helping people in difficult circumstances, not only with the knowledge he has learned, but also with the kindness and patience that Miss Rosen has taught him. Ethan understands that any small action can change someone's life, just like the way he changed Mrs. Rosen's life by simply fixing a refrigerator. On the day Ethan graduated from college, he stood on stage with his engineering degree in hand, his eyes looking at the antique watch Mrs. Rosen had given him, resting neatly on his wrist. He knew that Mrs. Rosen, even though she was no longer in this world, was always watching and proud of what he had achieved. Ethan not only became a successful engineer, but also continued her legacy: kindness, tolerance, and unconditional love. Ethan later opened a repair company and invented useful tools for the community. He continues to help people in his neighborhood, just like he did when he was a 10-year-old boy. Not only that, Ethan also set up a charity to support disadvantaged children, giving them the opportunity to study and pursue their dreams, just like he received from Mrs. Rosen. Every time someone asks Ethan about his inspiration, he smiles and talks about Miss Rosen, the person who taught him what kindness is, what the power of giving is. For Ethan, she is not only a friend, a teacher, but also someone who changed his life forever. The fire of kindness that Mrs. Rosen lit in Ethan's heart has now spread wider than ever. His life is a living testament to the impact that a small action, a sincere heart can bring.